a god, I think, of distance and rationality more than a god of love.
Perhaps the most tragic of Apollo's romantic escapades was his love for Cassandra, daughter of the king of Troy. As Greek mythology would have it, Apollo and Cassandra's tragic affair would directly impact the course of history.
He falls in love with Cassandra, who's a princess in Troy, and he says, you know, I'll give you the gift of prophecy if you will sleep with me. And she says, okay, and he does, and then she rejects him, and he makes it so that no one will ever believe any of her prophecies.
And thus, according to Homer, a seemingly insignificant lovers' squabble later played a major role in one of the classic battles of the ancient world, the Trojan War.
The Greek stories of Homer told of a glorious day in which all the Greeks actually did one thing together. They did an expedition, and they fought the Trojans.
According to Homer, the conflict begins when Paris, son of the king of Troy, kidnaps the beautiful daughter of a Greek king. Furious at the abduction, the king and his brother unite all the leaders of the Greek world to join in an attack on Troy. For 10 long years they lay siege to the city, but to no avail. Troy is a fortress, all but impenetrable. And then a Greek general named Odysseus comes forward with a plan that will echo through history. He suggests the Greeks build an enormous wooden horse and pretend to leave Troy, as if the great horse were a parting tribute. But Helen, the Greek princess, who has now fallen in love with her captor, knows her people well and suspects a trick.
Helen, who went and imitated the voices of many wives of the companions of the Greeks and walked around the Trojan horse, hoping that some of them might hear the voices of their wives and really cry out. Odysseus was the one that restrained his companions from revealing themselves.
And so, tragedy awaits the unsuspecting Trojans. The horse is brought inside the walled city. But they have one more chance when Cassandra, the Trojan woman who spurned the god Apollo's advances, also tries to warn her fellow citizens.
Another warning came from Cassandra, the Trojan princess. She had been given the gift of prophecy by Apollo in exchange for sleeping with him. But in the end, she refused, so Apollo made sure that nobody would believe in her prophecies.
And thus the god Apollo gets his revenge on Cassandra, the mortal who spurned him. It is unfortunate for the citizens of Troy. After much feasting and celebrating, the Trojans fall asleep. Late at night, under cover of darkness, the Greek armies return. Within the walled city of Troy, Odysseus and his men slip quietly out of the wooden horse's belly and unlock the city gates. The Greeks storm through the now open gates and lay waste to the city. But revenge does not a better lover make. Apollo would remain a failure in affairs of the heart. In stark contrast to Apollo in the area of romance is the other god who presided over Delphi, Dionysus.
Dionysus, on the other hand, is a guy you'd expect to have a lot of luck with the ladies. He's a god who is a god of the vines, he's a god of wine, he's a god of vegetation, he's a god of the sea. So he's a god who's been described as a god of the fluid element, a god of fluidity. And I think that's an excellent description because he's a god who can induce madness on the individual. Your mind can turn to a fluid mush if you're under the influence of Dionysus, whether it's through drink or through some religious ecstasy.
Strong emotion is Dionysus, formal expression is Apollo. Of course, that idea, which is as well known as the division between classical and romantic, is no longer valid. Yet, the idea of relating Apollo and Dionysus was one that was quite pertinent in antiquity. During the 3 winter months at Delphi that Apollo was absent, Dionysus replaced him. Dionysus is the god of civic disorder, but also the god of imperial democracy, whereas Apollo is the god of civic order.
And thus, as is so often the case with the gods of ancient Greece, there is a moral to the story. In this case, the lesson lies in the very contrast between Apollo and Dionysus.
Dionysus is a god who is worshipped by women and is worshipped in the countryside and leads women out of their homes, away from their looms, to the tops of mountains where they dance all night and carry torches. And men thought drank a lot. We think about Apollo as the god of reason, as the god of order. On his temple at Delphi, there are all these things. It says, nothing too much, Medenagon, nothing too much, moderation in all things.
While the gods loved, battled, and ruled over earth and sky, beneath the fertile folds and sun-drenched landscape of ancient Greece lay another domain, a dark and foreboding place. When the Greeks of ancient times died, they were either buried or cremated. Beyond death lay the underworld, a type of shadow existence where there was no conscious afterlife. No one went to heaven. That was the exclusive domain of the gods.
After death, we have a soul, according to the Greeks, which is called psyche, which goes fluttering off like a shadow of smoke into the underworld. Now, when you get to the underworld, this place is called Hades, or it's sometimes called the house of Hades, because Hades is the god of the underworld. And there's a journey that the soul has to take.
The journey was across the fabled river Styx, or river of hatred, with a man named Charon to ferry the soul over.
You have to pay Charon your obols or 2 obols to get across the river, and that's why these coins were put in the mouths of the corpse upon death. When you got there, the first thing you meet is Cerberus, this 3-headed guard dog at the door to the underworld. You went by, because you were a dead man, you were allowed in. If you tried to get in as a live man, you were eaten alive by this thing.
In Homer's telling, Hades is a grim and dreadful place. It is so bleak, no temple for Hades exists anywhere. The underworld is described as a place where human spirits suffer an eternity of empty dreams.
Hades is terrible and inexorable, but he is not the punisher of souls like Satan in Christianity. Psyche in Greek means breath, comes from a verb psychein, which is to breathe. Now, when someone dies, he no longer breathes. Psyche has really been translated as soul. Now, psyches in the underworld have no consciousness.
There are two levels to the underworld. The first, called Erebus, is where the human soul passes immediately after death. The second is a deeper and more terrible place called Tartarus. Those unrepentant and violent souls who have offended the gods are banished to dreaded Tartarus.
One of the most famous characters who was put into Tartarus was a fellow named Tantalus. And Tantalus was made to stand in a river with a fruit tree over his head. And he was eternally thirsty and eternally hungry, because whenever he reached to drink out of the river, the water would flow through his hands and he couldn't get it to his mouth. And when he reached for the fruit of the tree over his head, it would always move just out of reach. And so he was eternally tantalized, as we have the word from it now.
Thus, the gods and their stories gave meaning to the different cycles of life, and even the possibility of an afterlife. They also helped the Greeks establish a morality and a body of ethics. In ancient Greece, one of the most advanced civilizations of its time, these stories eventually inspired the birth of a new art form, the theater. Later, playwrights such as Euripides, Sophocles, and Aristophanes dramatized them, allowing the epic tales to come to life for people throughout the centuries.
The relation of literature to myth and religious belief among the Greeks is a very complicated one. You have to remember that for them, literature, poetry especially, was not the preserve of an educated elite. It was not even originally meant to be read. It was publicly performed. It was accessible to everyone.
They had various kinds of performances. They had oral poetry, choral dancing, drama, but they would never think of it as something like one category, and especially they would never think of reading this material. You had it performed. And therefore it's much more deeply embedded in the local culture. It's not something that only a few people do, read these works. It's something that everybody hears and sees.
Some of the early authors crafted their plays and poetry around themes which were critical of the gods, something which later philosophers vehemently condemned.
Plato's criticism of traditional literature and of the stories in them was that the gods essentially didn't act like gods. I think Plato especially was very uncomfortable with that because of his own notion of what a god ought to be. You can see some of the same critique in Euripides, in his tragedies, his sense that, gods shouldn't really act the way that a lot of the myths he's treating dramatically show them.
Certainly when you look at a drama like the Ion, in which Apollo is represented as a rapist, you begin to question the value of a god like that.
Some philosophers believe that redemption is the moral of the story. By the end of the play, the woman who is raped becomes the mother of Apollo's son, Ion. He goes on to become the leader of the city-state of Athens. Many of the plays reflected the more tempestuous side of human nature in the conduct of the gods. Sexuality and affairs of the heart were controlled by Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, love, and fertility. Just like Apollo, Aphrodite lived a turbulent life.
Aphrodite was connected with warfare through her union, her affair with Ares, the god of war. And they were two famous lovers. Aphrodite wasn't actually married to Ares. She was married to Hephaestus, or Vulcan, the god of the forge. But she had this flaming affair with Ares, the war god. And the question is, why are these two always getting together? It's the fury of their mutual passions which made them two gods that were